So, ladies and gentlemen, we have today Indian princes versus the Raj. Because of the oddly piecemeal way in which the British, by subversion and evil tyranny and battles and trickery, managed to piece together their empire, even at the height of the Raj, 2/5 of the Indian landmass was never ruled by them. The princely states ranged from huge land masses like Kashmir and Hyderabad, each of which was the sort of size of large chunks of Western Europe, through to tiny one-horse states, which barely made up a township or a village. There were, I think, was it 540 of them or something like that in all?
I think you're right.
65.
Yeah.
My maths is never my strong.
565.
565. And a wide variety of responses to them. God created the Maharajahs, wrote Kipling, so that mankind could have the spectacle of jewels and marble palaces. But not all observers were so enamored with Indian princes. Indian nationalist leaders like Nehru and Gandhi regarded them as foolish and wasteful playboys, spineless quizzlings of the British. Curzon took an equally dim view and wrote to Queen Victoria, railing in his despatches about that category of half-Anglicised, half-denationalised European women hunting, pseudo-sporting, very often and spirit-drinking young native chiefs. So we have a distinguished panel here, gathered with rather different views. Charles, who is the direct descendant of John Nicholson, who I've described as the greatest imperial psychopath of his generation. Charles was, I think, almost the very first person I ever read on the Raj. When I first went, aged 18, to India, his Plain Tales of the Raj was a huge bestseller in the late 70s, and since then has produced a wonderful galaxy of different books, ranging from the Indian princes through to the Buddha and the Sabs, Ashoka, and most recently Coromandel.
Ashoka.
And a wonderful array of wonderfully learned and readable books that have entertained generations of readers. To my left, Jon Wilson, a great scholar whose India conquered last year, was much chosen in the Books of the Year roundups, and greatly admired by a variety of scholars on different ends of the political spectrum. One of the few books by Brits on the Raj that Shashi has taken a liking to. Despite John...
And not descended from anyone.
Not descended from any psychopaths. Despite John actually taking Shashi on very bravely in front of a Desi audience at Jaipur a year and a half ago. And here we have, I think, neither a denationalised nor, but possibly spirit-drinking Indian prince. I'm not sure about European women hunting, but we can find out. Yes,
met with some success.
Guilty. Curzon knew what he was talking about. There we go. Moin Mir, who's written a fantastic book, available in the bookshop upstairs, The Prince Who Beat the Empire, which is a micro-study of one particular story of his own family's fight for justice against the East India Company. The whole story of the Raj is full of stories of various Moguls and princes who send delegations fruitlessly to London seeking justice. I think yours is a rare case of a family who did succeed in bringing their case here. So I think we're going to start with Charles. We're going to work from left to right. Charles is going to talk, in a sense, of the social context, introduce the concept of the princes for 10 minutes, move on to John, who's going to talk more politically, and then Moin will tell his own family story to finish up. So, Charles, take it away.
Thank you very much. I was very lucky years ago. Everything I've done was about 40 years ago, but going round with a dear friend, talking to all these erstwhile royal families, and getting them to talk for the first time, particularly going into Zananas. I mean, I wasn't welcome, but my dear friend Sharda was able to get access, and we found ourselves quite sympathetic at the end of it, in terms of trying to preserve something of the culture and their feelings of this particular ruling caste, you might say. And I thought it might be useful if I literally just spend 10 minutes zipping, and I'm going to do it very fast, giving quite a superficial social glimpse, so that everybody here, if they're not familiar with the setup, will have some idea of what we're talking about. Really beginning with this very ancient institution. Where are we? Can we go back to the very first one again? Is that possible?
Charles, you can control it yourself.
Charles, you have a pointer.
Yeah, that's fine. Where are we? I'm not sure if we can or not. No, okay. just pick it up wherever you are, and I'll just run from there. But leave it longer on the first one in that case. Where are we? Okay, that's fine. Okay, on to the next one. That's lovely. Okay, just very quickly, if anywhere the concept of kingship has been more rigorously defined, it's in India. You have, the word Raja or Rao is one who rules. And right from the beginning, this is the days of Ashoka, we actually have a very clear image of the ruling person. And his first responsibility, he has very laid down responsibilities. And the first one is that he is there to defend. He's there as a defender of people. And so he's picked out for his warrior qualities. And this is the first quality. And when you look at the Varna, the caste system, you see that the two key castes within Indian and the what you might call the ruling caste, there is the Kshatriya, he's the warrior, also known as the Rajput, the sons of rulers. And the other one, of course, is the Brahmin, who is the counselor and also takes over all the sacerdotal duties. So we have this double thing. So we get very soon, we get this idea of the warrior prince. I'm sorry, can we slow it down a wee bit? Very soon. He has certain duties. Annadatta, he's called Ma-Bap. He becomes a mother and father of his people. Annadatta, he's the giver of food. That's his role, is to provide for the people. He's also there to extend his kingdom. He actually has quite an aggressive role as laid down in the ancient texts. And of course, in return for that, he gets certain privileges. One of them being access to women, I'm sorry to say. So he tends to have large, and indeed he sows his seed. I mean, this is part of the concept. Right from the very early days, when we look at DNA testing, we can see that the successful ruler sows his seed widely. But also, of course, he's rewarded. He is the symbol of the state, and so now we can move on. And so very quickly, he has all these ideas of that he is the state. So he's loaded with privileges, but what happens then? He is simply chosen originally because he's the strongest, he's the fittest defender. But the hereditary principle comes in, and therefore you have the Yuvaraj, the Nawabzada, the heir apparent, and then you start to get what you might call an element of corruption, because is he the fittest to rule? And then in some Muslim states, of course, actually it was a question of, who was the best, and we'll have him, not the hereditary. So you can see here the young prince is spoiled, he's treated, but also if you carry on now, that's it, we are now in a kind of, if you can keep that system going, he's also trained in being a warriorship, and so we very soon, who do they take it out on? Under the British, of course, they're no longer allowed to invade anybody else, so they tend to kill animals, and there's an awful lot of that goes on. On we go. This is a Palanpur, if anybody. But nevertheless, he is there. He is the symbol of the state, and the state is very proud of him. And a great deal of cultural phenomena occur around him. I mean, all the money, the privileges that go with it, all the craftsmanship, they're invested in the ruler and the royal family. The other side of it, of course, is that he's a patriarch. It's a very patriarchal society, and the women are, even within the Hindu tradition, very much in zanana. You have the mardana where the men live, and the zanana where the women folk of the ruler live. And these are possibly the last glimpses of that kind of world. And moving around, this is not a Muslim state, this is a Hindu state, and they're going in purdah. So the top castes are very much, you might say, isolated from the community. The idea, of course, is that they're being protected because they're very valuable. You can't have our women being taken away. On we go. Then, of course, you have the eruption of the Moguls who take over the running of India, and you have this particularly under Akbar, you have a very settled community. Alas, it doesn't last, and under Aurangzeb, we move on, Aurangzeb, who's here, we very quickly find in his last 25 years the beginning of the collapse of the Mughal state. He overspends, the economy collapses, and with his death, there's a...
Watch your microphone with your paper.
I'm so sorry. With his death, implosion, and in 1707, there's a huge vacuum is created by the loss of power at the center, and all the viceroys, all his governors, they all believe that they have a kingdom to make, and this is where we now get what we think of as the Maharajahs really becoming established. And so one of those persons who move in, of course, the East India Company. This is James Todd, who gives an image of, he famously wrote about the annals of Rajasthan and how wonderful these Rajput warriors are because they had a huge history. A history, incidentally, that was, of course, denied by Macaulay, who said that Indians had no history. If you look at the annals of Rajasthan, I mean, they go right back to the 4th and 5th centuries. So, I mean, that's a load of bollocks, and unfortunately, Macaulay promoted as the idea of India as a place without culture. And that was the British who were going to civilize them. On we go. So the Brits come in and they establish themselves. They create a whole series of treaties with local rulers. The famous phrase, divide and rule. I'll make friends with you and let's make war on him together. And so this is basically, you can apply that, divide et imperium. And this to me symbolizes this unequal relationship because basically these treaties, these sanads, they are unequal. The Brits say, look, we're going to protect you, which means you don't need any soldiers. You mustn't make war on anybody. You can rule your own state and you can taxes, you can build railways, all that, but we're actually going to boss you about. And so you get the figure of the resident who comes in, and he really more or less, he's there to advise. He's representing the Queen, in fact. He actually represents the Viceroy who represents the Queen. Can we move on? Yeah, thank you. And so this is the point, really, I'm now going to stop at 1857. This is when the East India Company finally faces its ultimate crisis, and it collapses. And this is the point where you get this extraordinary system set up of 112 ruling princes, salute princes, who are given privileges, which is summed up in terms of gun salutes. I mean, it's ridiculous. 21 at the top, down to 9, but all on top of that, there are also hundreds of other ones. So India is now divided, a yellow map and a pink map, and as Willie has said, 2/3. So on we go, and I'm going to wind up very quickly. So on the one hand, let's say Mysore, a very large and wealthy state, and a tiny little one here, literally just a couple of acres and a cow, and pretty, what you might call, fairly jungly is the word that I would use. On we go. And nevertheless, the dominant figure of the resident who's there to advise but actually bullies. And he always has the threat, if you step out of line, we can depose you. On we go. This is that's Jai Singh, I think. And then, of course, what the British then need to do is, as in terms of Curzonian terms, we need to civilize this guy, which means the princes, what we do, we'll Anglicize them. And so very quickly, the British influence is there. Now, here's a really good example, because not all the princes went along with this. Can we go back to that one a second? Do you mind? Sajirao Baroda. His two predecessors had both poisoned each other and died. This young man had the luck to survive for 67 years as a ruler, and he really puts Baroda on the map as a modern state. He invests in industry, he invests in his people, famously Dr. Ambedkar, who is an outcast. He's from the outcast community. He sees that he's educated and sent to London to be educated and so on. So Saiji Rao, you can see he's surrounded by European teachers and scholars and so forth. And so he ruled wisely and well. Oh, we can get another extraordinary example, the Begums of Bhopal, which is a Muslim state. But the Nawabs are rather weak, and so they mysteriously disappeared and their wives took over. So we had a succession of very strong women. Well, two of them certainly disappeared. And you can see they're still in Purdah. She rules in Purdah, but with a rather violent...
They still rule Bloomsbury, India. Faiza Khan is a Begum of Bhopal.
And on we go. And there's the next picture. Now, this is just a weird picture. I was staying in an ex-palace, and there was a picture behind glass, and I tried to take it. And it's the viceroy surrounded by the Begum, but it looks as if you're surrounded by ghosts. And you can see me in the picture as well, just to confuse the issue. So on we go. Very quickly, I'm going to finish off now. We've got to finish off. So yes, there were bad rulers who became good ones. Jagat Singh of Kapurthala, I think is famous, again ruled for 67 years. So yes, he was a great womanizer. He loved European women. He loved France. He famously modelled his palace on Versailles. And here's one of his lady wives. But he, nevertheless, I think a damn good ruler. On we go. Let's have a bad one. Jai Singh of Alwar, deposed for gross depravity. of the most gross kind, may I say. Well, not by now, Jai Singh also famously, all gloves when everybody shook hands with a European, he famously came over and spoke at the House of Lords in Sanskrit. And when asked why, he said, well, you come to my country and speak in English. So you've got to admire him. Famously, a guy who bankrupted his state, Bharatpur, by giving the most ridiculous shoots, which destroyed all the wildlife. But thank heavens he was deposed, and the Bharatpur Wildlife Reserve, thanks to him. So at least there's that little heritage. On we go. We're going to finish off now. Modernization, the image of the Raj, of Maharajahs is very largely created by these two people, Jaipur. Jai Singh of Jaipur, who famously married Gayatri Devi, both very, very modern figures, determined to modernize their state. Cecil Beaton goes there. And so we get this image of the Maharani, which is totally bogus, because most of the Maharanis we spoke to had actually spent their early lives in Parda and in the Zanana. But Gayatri Devi, bless her, she really was determined to be modern, and I think she's been a marvellous figure. And yet, there lies the root of the downfall. We can come forward to... somebody's going to talk.
The root of the chiffon sari.
On we go then, and we'll just finish off here. Yes, I mean, nevertheless, there was this situation. What happens in 1947, well, 37 in fact, and maybe Moin or Jon will speak about this in greater detail. What do the princes do? The British were determined that the princes should continue in some form. It wasn't going to work. How on earth can you incorporate them into a modern democratic India? And so was this crisis. This is Baroda, who insisted on trying to live in the past, you know, flaunting their jewelry and so on. And so eventually, somebody will talk about it, an accommodation. These Maharajas, to my mind, made a huge sacrifice, which to say we will subordinate our will to the will of the people, and we will surrender our rights in return for some privileges of pension and so on. And this was fine up till 1962. And somebody will know the last slide. Gayatri Devi, Maharani of Jaipur, or Rajmata, I should say, stood for Parliament by the greatest majority I think has ever happened. She won, she swept in. Mrs. Gandhi saw the writing on the wall and said, we can't have these. These guys are a threat both to Congress and indeed to democracy. Can we move on? And this is Gayatri Devi speaking in public. At 1962, 1970, they are de-recognized and they lose everything. That's my bit. Thank you.
I once interviewed Rajmata Gwalior, who had been put by Mrs. Gandhi into prison downstream from Gayatri Devi's cell. And there was a common gutter which ran between the two. And she said she was almost sort of wafted out by all the Chanel bath essences coming down the common drain from Gayatri Devi.
These two strong women opposed by another one. Yeah.
So there's an important story about women and being ruling states and so forth that underpins a lot of this. So we're not just talking about princes. There's a fantastic piece of correspondence in late 18th century Bengal where the British government is, thinks that women can't run anything. Kind of they don't trust women in charge. They get manipulated by courtiers and so forth. And there's these male Muslim landholders who the British are saying, well, look, kind of you need to be running your estates, and they say, no, come on, we want to relax, we want to let the women get on with it, sort of. And so there's this, and three, kind of Indian princesses, I guess, are doing the work of ruling. So there's this is Indian princes, but a lot of the time we're not talking about princes who are doing the job of administration. So I want to talk just quickly about how you end up with princely states and the process by which this kind of complicated map that Charles and William have discussed emerges. And I want to talk very quickly about one particular prince, Aamir Khan, who is the Nawab of Tonk between 1817 and he died in 1834. And is a prince in exactly the way we've described. Kind of sort of doesn't have much external power, manages the business within his own state, kind of very well. Is a great patron of culture and arts and so forth, and lots of the material from Tonk actually is in. Willie tells me is in the Royal Galleries now, so you can go and see it. So, but who?
An armour made of pangolin skins.
Oh, fantastic!
From
So
Tonk.
I need to go there. But who was this? Who is this man, Aamir Khan? Well, he started off as an Afghan warrior, as a warlord, as somebody who was subcontracted by the Maratha states in the late 18th century to do fighting for them, to kind of fight amongst each other and fight the British. So this is somebody who began as somebody who's effective at gathering together troops, marshalling men, money, gathering the resources that are needed to fight. And so what happens? Well, this is a point where British power is spreading throughout Western India, throughout the whole of India. And the one thing the British have is money, and kind of the British don't fight any better than Indians. They don't marshal troops any better than Indians, but they have access to capital from kind of London, which Indian princes don't have, and so
local bankers too.
And also local, and then that connects up with this with local finance. And so through, if you like, the British control of money and being able to buy off warlords here, there, everywhere, etc. In the early 19th century, we're talking here. The states that someone like Aamir Khan would work for, are the states that prop up their, his own job as being a warlord, collapse and begin to become poorer and poorer. And when you have the last flourish, if you like, of Western Indian military power in 1817, when the Peshwa puts on this incredible display of military force, but which lasts in Pune which lasts for a couple of months, but then there's no power behind that. So Aamir Khan recognized that he needs to concede to the British, that they're the only power because of their money in town, and so you get this incredibly elaborate staged ceremony. And the other thing that's happening is all his soldiers are rebelling and going off to work for other people, and he's worried for his own life unless he actually creates this kind of settled state of affairs, and is protected by someone stronger than him. He could die. So you get this elaborate choreographed ceremony in December 1817, where David Ochterlony, the kind of British officer, is on one elephant, and Aamir Khan is on another elephant, and they come together. And it's this handover of power, and the pageantry, which is all designed by the British, not by Aamir Khan, is kind of incredibly elaborate in the way in which Charles, to some degree, is.
Ochterlony, who described Charles's friend James Todd as too much a Rajput to deal with the Rajputs.
Oh, really?
So, with all these stories, Willie knows everything else more than any of us. So you get this incredibly elaborate ceremony. And Ochterlony is being kind of pompous and magnificent, and Aamir Khan is just fed up and tired and frustrated, and he's saying chala, we need to get on with it. We need to get on with this. So he's not, we know Aamir Khan is just doing a deal, kind of to protect himself and to kind of maintain his security, and is not interested in the kind of pageantry and whatever else. And so actually, what Aamir Khan does is run a state well, manage this regime with. Which is a part of a broader British polity, in the early 19th century. But the British are suspicious continually about what happens, and in a sense they have reason to be, because Aamir Khan dies in 1834.
He kept changing sides.
In his
early days.
No. In his early days he does. Yeah, that's right. But once he submits, he's there, in the state of Tonk, and somewhere like Tonk actually becomes a centre of a culture of critique of the British, of opposition, of Wahhabism, well, let's not call it Wahhabism, but of different kinds of.
I call it Wahhabism.
Different kinds of Muslim, political ideologies, etc., that are critical of British power. And so, fast forward, and this is my source for this is Willie's work, but fast forward to kind of 1857, and where is the place from which kind of the last bastion of Wahhabi quote fighters who come jihadi fighters who come to defend Delhi, where does it come from? They come from Tonk. They come from 4,000 fighters in 1857 go and defend Delhi immediately before, So you've got a princely state which is a centre of theoretically is kind of submissive to British rule, and yet actually is a centre of something very different. Wow. We don't quite know what.
Can I tell a little story there? When Delhi falls to the British in September 1857, And they're very nearly defeated. They're held up at Kashmiri Gate, and it can go either way. The future of India is sitting in the balance. And then there's an eclipse, and the Hindu troops take this as a bad omen and run. And the British wake up in their trenches at Kashmiri Gate, suddenly find the enemy barricades empty. And they march through these suspiciously empty streets. There's no one moving, nothing happening, completely empty. Shuttered doors, shuttered windows. And the first troops come gingerly up towards the Jama Masjid through the side gate, what's now called Gate D, when you go there, the northern gate of the Jama Masjid. And there's no sound, there's no silence. And suddenly there's this creak as the doors open. And 700 jihadis from Tonk, armed with battle axes, come running down the steps and make this last stand outside the Jama Masjid. All are killed. Yeah. But it's a sort of last sort of heroic moment. And not one of them has a firearm. Yeah. It's an extraordinary moment. Anyway, sorry.
But let me... So just quickly to go on and to broaden things out a bit, that 1857 is a crucial moment in redefining the relationship between the princes and the Raj, but it's not. But in a sense, things don't necessarily get easier. You do have the British ability to depose rulers. You do have the British attempt to educate kind of princes. And I think what's really important to remember is these princes, they're not Indian nationalists. Often they have more affinity with British monarchs, British kind of princes and princesses than they do with kind of the people the Indians they rule. They often see themselves, and that's something that actually Victoria does very successfully, as part of a kind of global elite of monarchs. They're part of a sort of monarchical international in some senses. So there's a kind of complicated relationship here. They're not it's wrong to see them as kind of nationalists, and yet they engage in this complicated set of ways, or they create states that that engage in these complicated and interesting and often quite autonomous ways with respect to the Raj. And a couple of points to kind of end with on that. Does anybody know what the second biggest bank in India is right now?
Baroda.
Bank of Baroda. Right. So you have an institution that is vital for the history of modern India.
And sponsors of the Jaipur Literature Festival.
I didn't even know that. That's terrible. Right, so kind of. But so anyway, the sponsors of the Jaipur Literary Festival, which is what I should have said a moment ago. Bank of Baroda. Forget the second biggest bank business. It was founded in, I think, 1908 by Sayajirao Rao. Kind of in Baroda. At the same time as the Swadeshi movement, at the same time as this kind of nationalist, campaign, which was all about Indians building their own institutions, not to kick the British out, but to Indians build their own institutions in order to kind of run their own lives and create their own economy and create their own finances. So this is this kind of weird paradoxical thing. You have this monarch who is, engaged in kind of Indian institution building at that moment. A lot of them didn't do that, but kind of many do. So yeah, and I don't want to make a for or against argument here. I'm just saying what the broad map of what princes are about is, and kind of the Bank of Baroda is a really interesting moment. There are other members of the Indian elites do similar things in different places. Kind of not princes, but lawyers and whatever. There is this complicated relationship. It's not so simple to even say that, and I'm going to end in a moment, that the princes or the princely states were kind of nullified or were kind of somehow or other opposed by the kind of spirit of the Indian nation, kind of the state. There isn't this kind of prince versus kind of republican kind of opposition necessarily in such a simple way. Although that's the way Indira Gandhi wanted to kind of to see it. So, my final character is Vishal Aishwarya, someone whose statues of whom is all over India, who was born in Mysore, somebody who worked in the kind of Imperial Public Works Department, and then worked for the state of Mysore, built some of kind of the first big dams. As much as whether we like them or hate them, some of the first big dams were built in Mysore, not under direct British rule. And then wrote the series of texts that really kind of are the first attempt to invent planning in modern India. So there's a book, The Reconstruction of India in 1920, and then 1936, I think it's called something like Planning in India. This is someone who's working for a princely state, working for the state of Mysore, and yet his kind of ideas and then end up being taken over by the kind of the Republic of India. So it's a complicated story, and it's not simply the case that there's this battle. It's not simply princes versus the Raj, and it's not simply princes versus the Republic.
Before we move on to Moin's specific, detailed micro story, so to speak, just to ask a couple of general questions to both of you. How far, John, do you think the British sort of created the Prince of States? Because you had a very diverse group of very different peoples. Marathas, who seized a bit of territory here, a Mughal governor in Hyderabad, Afghan warlord, a mercenary sitting in Tonk. And the British, in a sense, sort of push them into one category, the Maharaja. Are they a British invention, and are we talking about lots of different things that have been put into one category, or is it actually represent the diverse forms of Indian kingship which pre-exist colonial rule?
I think it's neither of those two things. I think it's the British create this framework, and they create. We know Charles's work is very good on this. Another work, there is this attempt to create a single ranking system, a single structure, very rigid structure within which all the princes fit, and they are diverse and they have this incredible complexity. But that's there. But I think also they to some degree invent themselves, and they talk amongst each other about what they are as rulers, as monarchs, as princes within kind of British India. So yes, there is this British attempt to create this overall structure, which is and diversity remains part of that. The names of princes, there's no Indian word to describe who they all are because they're so different. And yet they also create this idea of, if you like, an Indian monarchy that is important. And that's something that scholars actually
begin to give British things like thrones and crowns and
I think
sorry,
carry on.
I'm going to have to. I think the British had no option. I think the point is that they were a tiny group of people, and the only way to rule was to rule indirectly. In other words, to get other people to rule for you. I mean, that's a very effective way. I mean, it's Julius Caesar onwards. It's what's happened, and I think they had no option. But I do think they very soon realized that when they tried to break down the system, and I know Moin's going to talk about the doctrine of lapse in a minute, it very quickly backfired on them. We're talking about Jhansi would be one good example. Talk about Awadh would be another one. If you say you're going to depose you because you're corrupt, which is basically a way of swallowing into the central state, they fight back. And I think that this is perhaps a nice way to lead to your story.
I'll just very quickly talk about what you asked, William. It was very complex, particularly in Gujarat, in Kathiawar. We know Gujarat, a particular part of Gujarat is called Saurashtra, which basically means 100 states. There were 260 princely states just in Gujarat. Some of them, as you mentioned, William, were just a bunch of little acres. Some of them had a few villages, and they were independent rulers. So how do you put them all together? And so they came up with this solution called the Kathiawar Western Agency states, and then they broke them down in terms of ranks, in terms of gun salutes, in terms of all kinds of things. But coming to my book. It's a personal story. It's a story of what this particular family went through, during a period of about 70 odd years, and at the heart of this is Surat, which I grew up in between Bombay and Surat, and every time I would go to Surat with my grandfather, he would hand me, and he would take it back. Obviously, he would hand me a book which was Debate in the House of Commons, 1857, and it was the minutes of the debate that one of our ancestors had in the House of Commons, and he would say, "This is going to change your life." And then every time we'd return from Surat, he would grab it back and take it back, But the one thing that he would always say when we went to Surat was, this was India's greatest port. This was a port that was bursting with color and fragrance, and the most incredible bazaars that surrounded the docks. And you had Arabs trading there, and the Portuguese, and all kinds of people. And when I would look at Surat, back in the 80s, I would say, "Good God, really is this? It can't be that. Please, let's just go back to Bombay."
Place where bubonic plague famously broke out.
Exactly. But then, as time passed, and I moved to England, before he passed away, my grandfather, he gave me this book, which was the minutes in the House of Commons in 1857, and I sat down and I read it, and it was astonishing, and it took me back to do more research in Surat. And what I realized was that so much had been written about the fall of many states. For example, a lot has been written about Awadh and how Awadh was taken over and how...
Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, the
Yes,
expert sitting
exactly.
in the audience.
Yes, of course. A lot has been written about this iconic clash between Tipu and Richard Wellesley, and how Mysore was annexed, and all of these incredible stories of how these states were annexed. But nothing was written about Surat. No one really knew what happened to Surat. How did Surat fall, and what was this thing that happened in the House of Commons? Anyways, as I was researching, I realized that this was an incredible story. The story begins in 1733, when the Mughal Empire is floundering. It's virtually, its decline has begun. Aurangzeb is dead in 1707, and Surat, which is this incredible port, is at the crossroads of its own destiny. And the East India Company is there. They had landed in 1612. They are very much a potent force there. They're itching to take Surat over. The Marathas are lurking in the shadows. They're constantly trying to take Surat.
Shivaji 3 times.
Shivaji in the 1600s has raided Surat. But it's still standing. It's still a thriving port. It's still a port which is colorful, and trade is prospering. And in all of this, the Surat Nawabs declare independence. The first Nawab is a guy called Teghba Khan, and he has this vision of a unified command, because the Mughals were very smart. They broke Surat and they had a divided rule. It was castle, which was governed by the Abyssinian Sidis, and the civil administration was with a mutasaddi or a clerk. And Teghba Khan is the first Nawab who brings it all together under one unified command, because he sees that there's a direct threat of an East India Company or a Dutch invasion, and because of that, there should be a unified command. So he takes over the castle, he puts the Sidi under him, and he brings about this unified command of Surat. And Surat somehow starts to prosper again.
This is while the British were doing Classy, isn't it? 1757?
Yes, but this is 1733.
Right.
But with the death of Teghba Khan, there is a certain vacuum once again that is created in Surat. And Nawab Muinuddin, who's his son-in-law, takes charge. However, it's kind of too late, because it's large parts of India are already kind of seeking independence, but the East India Company is on their borders. And in 1759, the company actually attacks the castle. Now, not very many people know that it was a virtual forceful invasion of Surat. And the castle falls after Nawab Muinuddin and the Sidi put up a united front. The battle lasts for, I think, about a couple of days, but they are beaten, and the castle falls. But Nawab Muinuddin refuses to open the city gates, and he says there is no way that you're going to take the city. And the city then comes to, there's this point where it could actually go up in flames if there's a forceful invasion of the city. Finally, an agreement is reached that the Nawabship will continue in terms of administration of the city, and the castle will remain with the East India Company. But I'll cut to 1800. It's 1800. The Nawab Nizamuddin, who's the grandson of Muinuddin, dies, and immediately after his death, his infant son also dies. And so Richard Wellesley, who's the Governor General of Hindustan at that time, he's brimming with confidence, because he's beaten Tipu, and Surat is there for the taking because there's no male heir. What he doesn't realize is that there is a younger brother of Nizamuddin who can succeed. But Wellesley goes in and threatens forceful invasion of the city if Nizamuddin doesn't sign a treaty. And what is the treaty? The treaty is that Nizamuddin would be allowed to keep his title of the Nawab. He would be paid £15,000 a year, and he would be allowed to keep his private estates, which is his own private property, his palaces, his orchards, his gardens, and all of that. Nasiruddin he contemplates street fighting, but it's useless. You can't match Wellesley's army at that time, because by then the East India Company is all powerful, and brimming with confidence. So he signs these papers. And Surat has finally fallen. So Surat finally falls in 1800 with this treaty that is signed with the Nawab. But I think what actually befalls the family now is a real example of the treachery of the East India Company. Within 42 years, the treaty is violated. And it's violated again because the last Nawab has left behind a daughter and 2 granddaughters. But before his death, the Nawab has appointed his daughter his successor. He has ordered the firing of the cannons, which is a symbol of appointing of a successor. During the Bismillah ceremony, where it is a ceremony in the Muslims where they actually start reading alphabets, he announces in public that she is going to be his successor. Sir John Malcolm, who is the governor of Bombay, has attended this lavish ceremony and has actually taken the daughter in his own lap and announced to everyone that she will be the successor. So East India Company actually acknowledges her as the successor. But there's something in the Nawab's mind which is keeping him, which is making him uneasy, and there's something which is not right, and so he starts looking for a son-in-law because he has no uncles, he has no cousins, and he has no brothers, and he knows that if he dies, the house would be a house of just women, and that could fall and capsize quite quickly. Now these estates are worth millions. They're about 3 palaces. A third of Surat is the private property of the Nawab, and the company is very much there on the lookout. So finally, he calls these 2 Mughal princes from Delhi, who he wants his daughters to get married to, Mirza Najaf and another Mirza Humayun. But they come to Surat and fling themselves into the pleasures of the city. They go to all the possible brothels, get drunk, and find themselves in opium dens, and he rejects them. Finally, there is one prince from a very tiny principality in Kathiawar called Kamandia. And this man is the son of a warrior who's also a fighter on behalf of the Maharajah of Baroda. And he picks this man to become the last custodian of his house. He comes in and he marries the daughter. All seems fine. But then the Nawab dies. Now, the minute the Nawab dies, the English East India Company refuses to recognize the daughter as a successor, refuses to recognize the adopted son-in-law, who's been adopted legally as the male heir, as the successor, stops the family's income of £15,000 a year, and brutally raids all the palaces and the estates and takes them over. And that leaves the granddaughters and this family on the brink of destitution. There's absolutely nothing to kind of live off, and they're confined to a 1-bedroom apartment at the corner of Hashmat Mahal, which was the palace that was usurped. And this is when the book kind of turns, because it's about now this prince who is left with no option but to fight the East India Company. He's luckily the son of a reasonably wealthy small little prince, because he's quite cash rich. So he pumps in the money to keep this little bit of an estate that he's been able to hold alive. But now remember, this is all happening before 1848, before the official doctrine of lapse. And the person who's doing this is Lord Ellenborough. So he's stopped the pension, he's usurped the estates, and he's left the family on the brink of destitution. But in an unprecedented counterattack, this prince, whose name is Mir Jafar Ali Khan, he decides not to challenge the East India Company in India, but to take them on in Britain. And this is an unprecedented act. I mean, a reasonable amount of princes had come to Britain. Some of them had come to see, for sightseeing. A large number of them had come just to complain meekly about what the company was doing. But this man comes with a plan. He wants to meet the movers and shakers in Britain and tell them about what's going on in India and what the East India Company is doing. So he lands up in 1844 in Britain with this entourage of his. He's got a translator called Lutfullah, who's more interested in the blonde-haired English beauties rather than putting his papers together for his prince, and all of these kind of things. And he comes to meet the chairman of the company. The meeting with the chairman goes off reasonably all right. The chairman kind of says this is flagrant injustice, but the deputy chairman of the company, Jon Wilcox, actually overrules the chairman and prevents the succession to happen and prevents the release of the estates. And basically, at this time in England, all hope is lost. But there's one particular meeting that changes things. Scott is another secretary of his, and he says, listen, I'll get you into Ascot. And I want you to go to Ascot, and I'll get you a box which is relatively close to a relatively powerful box, and that's the box of Queen Victoria and Albert. So go there dressed in your robes and your turbans and all of that, and let's see what comes of it. So he lands up sitting in this box, and inadvertently, Victoria looks at him. And during the break in Ascot, as there's a break during the in the racing, he's standing, and Victoria and Albert are at a distance, and she makes it a point to tell Albert that I want to walk towards this Indian Oriental. And that's the point in time when he is told by his secretary that if you get 10 seconds, just tell her what you've come here for. And he gets exactly that. He gets barely about 15, 20 seconds, and he tells her about the reason why he's here. Now, I think that is the moment of change in his life. Because Albert then tells him, listen, I want you to come to this particular event that is happening at the Royal Society of Arts, and I want to introduce you to someone. This is done rather tacitly because Victoria and Albert cannot be seen as supporting an Indian in Victorian England. Once again, just remember, this is 1844. The doctrine of lapse hasn't yet officially kicked in India, but it's happened to the Surat family. Anyway, so he goes to the Royal Society of Arts, and he's made to sit next to Prince Albert, and he's made to give out all the kinds of gifts for all these incredible discoveries that Britain is doing. And at the end of the evening, Albert introduces him to the most powerful lawmaker in Britain. And this man's name is Sir Richard Bethel.
3 minutes.
Okay, sorry. And finally, he meets Richard Bethel. Richard Bethel takes on his case, but he fails in 1844. He comes back to India. He mortgages all that his father has, all the lands, the orchards, and he goes back to England in 1853. Richard Bethel and Sir Fitzroy Kelly, who's the Solicitor General, take on his case, and for the first time an Indian enters the Houses of Parliament in 1853 to actually table a bill for the reinstatement of the estates. It's the first time an Indian has entered Parliament, and his bill is fought by East India Company MPs who want to ensure that the bill doesn't pass. It's a nail-biting finish, and in the end, it's the first time that a bill passes, 213 ayes in favor of an Indian and 28 noes against the East India Company. And it's the only time the East India Company is defeated in their own parliament. So that's the story.
Have you sold the film rights?
No, not as yet.
I'm sure we can find you an agent.
I forgot to mention one thing. He does fall in love with an English actress.
Hey.
But I'll let does he take her back to India?
A couple of questions to all of you before we open it up. First of all, there's a big difference between the places where the British ruled for 150, 200 years, like Bengal, where a lot of the princely states were swept away, and you lose the traditions of, say, miniature painting, of oral histories, of sometimes architectural traditions, and so on. And against that, somewhere like Rajasthan, where these things continue right up until the 1970s, and where lineages of painters and architects and oral historians and bards and things like. How important do you all think the cultural role of the Maharajahs were keeping the traditional arts of India going?
Well, Just a quick point on this, really, which is simply yes, of course, we can say that there were repositories of Indian culture that survived there that were swept away in places like UP and so on, where really there's a kind of non-culture. It's a bit rude to say that, but in the sense of, but then I think you've got to look at the other way around as well. Here were rulers who had enormous wealth, and what did they do with that wealth? Yes, they patronized the old industries, but not the new. And I think we've got to bear that in mind in terms of the economy of India. Now, we can be very rude about the British in the way that they invested in India, but there was money that had come outside and it went back. They didn't actually encourage the growth of infrastructures, and I'm sure John was going to enlarge on that. And when we look at the Indian princes, they had this resource. There's always been this problem of capital in India. The capital was not there. Now, Indian princes had capital, and when we look at Baroda, and we can see what could have been done, and in terms of modernization, and when you look at the other states in terms of, again, I mean, Baroda and the textile industry and all that owes an awful lot to Baroda. So here was a chance for India to fight back in terms of investment with money. Now, what did they do? So they were content basically to draw on the old revenues, in other words, from agriculture. And I think this is the great black mark for me when you look at the British rule in India, was that the way agriculture stagnated. Industry did pretty well, in fact. I mean, the textile industry was actually the fourth greatest in the world in India. And this is long, I mean, we're talking about 1920s, 1930s. So it's not as if actually there was a total draining of everything. But I do feel, I think the Indian princes are culpable in that particular cause, just to look backwards always and not to actually invest in the future. That's all I've got to say. And I think John probably knows a lot more about the politics of that.
I think that's right to some degree. I think that India under British rule in general is a place that sees an extraordinarily low amount of kind of investment in any kind. But I think and it would be really interesting to compare, systematically compare princely states versus areas under direct British rule. And my sense would be it's probably a bit higher in areas under princely rule. The point about the Raj is they don't invest in infrastructure. There is very little infrastructure. The railway, there's a whole other panel about this. But
bought it in and took it out again.
Precisely, the railways are a late and kind of relatively small compared to every other kind of similar sized society, etc. This story about infrastructure is problematic. I think
and it's also the big achievement of independent India in the immediate 30, 40 years after independence. Massive investment in particularly agriculture, in the Deccan, and irrigation and so on.
Yeah, and there aren't the same kind of famines that occur. So 2 points. One of which is if you look at the areas of growth post 47, you look at the areas now that are the most prosperous in India, and they don't exactly align, but there is some kind of correlation, I think, with where princely states were. Mysore, etc. Bangalore. The IT industry doesn't grow up in Calcutta. It's in Bangalore first, and partly I think that's because there is
Hyderabad.
Hyderabad too, exactly. So the two big IT cities of India are princely states. So there's something about that's a really complicated argument about why the complexity about why that happens. But I think it's something about some of the structures that prevent growth not being there, and structures that enable growth being there. There is an investment in science and so forth. And I think there's a broader point where it's not. Let's stop with this obsession about the ruler, about the prince. It's about a way in which rule occurs.
Wonderful councillors,
and so
the Brahmins who actually.
So I think there's a much more dispersed kind of way in which government happens in princely states compared, and we don't know enough about this. If you go off and do a PhD in Indian history, go and work in the archives of the the Hyderabad court, which is pristine, well documented, well catalogued, but nobody uses it very much. Some people do, of course, but so I think there's a kind of state that works in a much more complicated way, and where power is dispersed much more, which maybe allows actually kind of for some kind of patronage to occur, some kind of redistribution occur. Yes, in the old ways, but that's true. But there aren't the interests and incentives there for doing radical, new, innovative things anywhere in India.
One last query, bringing things up to date. Why is it that some families, for example, Gwalior, have adapted to independent India very successfully? You have at one point you had the BJP with one end of the family and the Congress with the other end of the family, but wherever they were, still effectively ruling. The Madhya Pradesh Gwalior area is still ruled by that family. and other areas where Prince rule's totally gone to the dogs, like like Hyderabad, where there's not even a trace of the family left.
Yeah.
Why do you think
They
that
had
is?
the same dilemma. Once they, I mean, sorry, yeah.
No,
Once,
I think
Go ahead.
you see that immediately after, in the first elections, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the first elections that India held, it was swept by the Rajwadas. You know, they were in power. They had won a large number of seats. I think there's a certain sense of, I think there's a certain sense of irrelevance. You know, I think Gwalior has done an incredible job of staying relevant in terms of politics.
Yeah.
They're there. They roll up their sleeves. They get their hands.
And whoever's in power. whether it's
And
BJP
whoever
or
is in
Congress.
power. Yeah, exactly. There is a certain sense of irrelevance of the Indian prince in today's day and age. He or she, they're not relevant anymore. You know, they're confined to little food festivals and things like that.
Big part of the tourist industry, then.
A huge part of the tour. I was coming to that. I mean, you know, I think the work that Babji in Jodhpur has done is splendid because he has made Rajasthan literally the brand ambassador of Indian tourism. And in so many ways, they're backseat drivers, you know, when it comes to tourism, when it comes to little local issues for farmers, etc.
Oh, do you want?
One thing that's very important is the choice that princes make, that rulers make in 1947. And of course, famous, Hyderabad, wants to become part of Pakistan and become independent. So, as does also, Travancore. And so there are states that just don't go with the flow of the kind of republic, and try and maintain their autonomy and independence, and then you end up with a kind of protest movements opposed to them and so forth. That's the story in
Razakas,
yeah, and so that's the story in Hyderabad. It's about an opposition to the direction of political change.
Yeah.
I can say one person.
I think we've got to open up at least a couple of questions. Before we all... Anybody?
I know we got
Gentleman at the back here and this lady here. Black T-shirt and white, whatever it is, dress. 1 second, a microphone is coming. No, you are right, but speak up.
Amartya Sen wrote a book about the Indian economy a couple of years ago in which he said that one of the reasons that Rajasthan was so behindhand was because of the legacy of the Maharajahs. Do you agree?
Yeah.
I know that I go to India often, I know about Jodhpur and Jaipur and all the things that they do, but do you agree with Amartya Sen's analysis?
I would very much agree with that statement. I think there was a great reluctance to take advice from anybody. And I do remember going around there and meeting these lovely guys and said, look, Charles, I've got this bloody great palace. It's vast. What the hell am I going to do with it? And, it's all very well. These Maharajahs, they've got Shekhawati, they've got all these lovely little places. I've got this bloody great place. What am I going to do with it? And they had no option. And you say, well, but I do feel in terms of modernization, they did cling to the past. There was this, and of course, people like Todd helped creating this great romantic idea of the Rajput warrior. The great bastion of the Hindus, etc., against invasion. And I think this relic did him a lot of harm. And I think it's really one of the saddest things was to find people clinging to privilege which is gone. But then you have the other. I mean, this is rather like the nobility in this country.
We have two very different ideas. Yeah. Charles, you're saying that you agree with this, that Amartya Sen says that the areas that were princely states were poor, and you are saying that the areas...
No, I'm sorry, I'm being really the boring historian and saying it's all very complicated. But, I think it's about how states respond to change. And in Rajasthan, because you have this invented idea that is, from Todd, and then now is the tourist image, that's something that people cling on to in a way that didn't happen in other places. So
we have in the front row here a prince who's also an industrialist. Which way would you answer that question, Uday? Well, were the princes impoverishing or industrializing?
Willie, I was going to go in a different direction, but thank you for asking me that. I think there's a lot of normative thinking behind the question. So what are we trying to preserve and what we're trying to do? So if economic development and social development are critical, then yes, of course you should go into modern politics. It's not only the Gwaliors, the Patialas have done the same. I could cite 50 royal families who have gone into politics in a modern sense. And there are many others who have completely collapsed, and others who are living with gun salutes, and others don't want to hear anything about it. Your point about complexity. But may I raise a slightly different point, which is that it wasn't terribly convenient in the 1950s, 60s, 70s to remember the princes as anything other than collaborative feudals who just... And that's why I love your story and some of the stories. You mentioned the point, I think, in your book a long time ago about the Raja of Aundh writing his constitution with Mahatma Gandhi. And the Raja of Sawantwadi gave Gandhi shelter.
Very, very good someone.
And there's so many examples. I remember the Drangadra family saying to me that when 47 came, the first thing they did was go into their palace compound and put up
the tricolour.
And in my family, my grandfather was someone whose story will come out in the next 12 months, but who became the longest prisoner of the Raj in the 20th century, and was a friend of Tilak, of Gokhale, yes. And Gandhi said we can have a national satyagraha about him, but no one's told the story because it wasn't convenient to remember. Because they had to be seen as
they were caricatured by the Congress.
And why was it convenient? The Brits wouldn't particularly want to remember these stories, and the Indians certainly wouldn't under Mrs. Gandhi. So thank you very much for all of you for bringing out these stories.
One last, we promised this gentleman a quick question.
Is there not always a tendency in general, like, to kind of criticize a lot of the Indian princes and the royal families, whereas at the same time, a lot of them are celebrated in Europe still? I mean, UK still has a monarch, for example. So why aren't, like, the Indian royals, who, of course, for more than, like, a good 1,000 years, like, helped shape the history of India, accorded the same place in history as...
Moin, are the Indian royals crudely caricatured and done down where they should be celebrated?
I agree with you there. I think there was this period in time, all the way till now, where the image of the Indian prince is of a floundering Nawab who's tumbling off his palace balcony after having watched Nautch Girls. That's the image. But it's so not true, because they were at the forefront of development. There were a large number of Indian princes who were out there working shoulder to shoulder with their people. I mean, Sayaji Rao Maharaja of Baroda was one of them. He had incredible foresight. He made girl-child education compulsory.
Ganga Singh of
Bikaner built incredible dams. Gondal, the Maharaja of Gondal, came to Eton and set up something quite like that in a small place like Eton. He got a degree in medicine himself. The list is never ending. But, as Uday, again, what he said is, it was convenient to forget them. It continues to be, it's even more convenient now to forget them. But it's important to tell their story. It's important to tell people that they were more than just, tumbling Nawabs of their palace balconies.
Last word to Charles.
One point, which I think is very crucial. There was this extraordinary act of patriotism that took place. Which was that all these persons who could have clung on to their powers and said, no, we're not going to come to some arrangement, with the modern India. This act of giving up all your privileges and powers, or virtually all privileges and power, an extraordinary act of voluntary surrender. And the politicians
slightly with their arms being twisted behind their back by
the idea that
Patel.
the idea that Patel came and twisted everybody's arms with threats, which is basically the Congress image, was, I think, a very bogus one. I mean, extraordinary acts of people coming forward, as you said, you quoted one or two examples, and that should be remembered. That really should be almost the greatest legacy that these guys did.
John. Sorry.
So I think, final sentence, which is to understand the history of Indian princes, you have to tell the story of the Indian Republic, because that's not, the kind of India we end up with is not inevitable from 1920, from 1930. There are lots of other ways in which India could have become independent. And the fact that India ended up as a republic, and you have this idea of popular sovereignty, is, if you like, why we end up with this image of the princes.
Ladies and gentlemen,